Hi, everyone. Welcome back for our final session, Beyond the Nation. So I think, the papers that we've heard the past couple of days, you're beginning to hear some themes repeat. And it was very difficult in terms of putting things on panels to decide what fit into which topic heading. But I think you'll hear some familiar stories in this next panel. To lead us through our final conversation is Bethel, is it Saylor or Saylor? Bethel Saylor, who is the Associate Professor of History at Haverford College in Haverford here in Pennsylvania. She's the author of The Settlers' Empire, Colonialism and State Formation in America's Old Northwest, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2015, which won the 2015 W. Turrentine Jackson Award from the Western History Association. The Settlers' Empire explores the inseparable cultural and political project of American state formation during the early Republic. Her current book project, The Fantastic Republic, North Africa and the American Imagination, 1783 to 1825, explores U.S. fictional and factual encounters with Islamic North African states as a window into the central place of imagination in early American politics and diplomacy. Bethel, the floor is yours.
Introduce our panelists for panel 6, Beyond the Nation. I'd like to introduce you to Matthew E. Franco, who earned his PhD in the history of science and technology from Johns Hopkins University. Professor Franco's research focuses on the function of geographic science in the Bourbon reforms, the history of cartography, and the early modern Spanish world. He currently teaches Latin American and early modern European history at Loyola University, Maryland, and Goucher College, both in Baltimore. Professor Franco previously taught at the College of William and Mary, the Johns Hopkins University, the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and Mount St. Mary's University. A lot of Marys you've got going there. He has articles published and forthcoming in the Journal of Iberian and Latin American Studies, Endeavor, and the Proceedings of the American Philosophical Society. Our second speaker is Jeffers Lennox. He's an associate professor of history at Wesleyan University with a focus on early North America. His book, Homelands and Empires, Indigenous Spaces, Imperial Fictions, and Competition for Territory in Northeastern North America, 1690 to 1763, explores Wabanaki British-French interactions in what is now northern Maine and the Maritime provinces of Canada. His current research project is North America, the Revolution, British provinces, and creating the United States, 1774 to 1815. And our last speaker is Jackson Pierson. He's a PhD student at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas. His research examines the Neutral Ground Agreement and the Louisiana-Texas borderlands, beginning with the Louisiana Purchase and concluding with the implementation of the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819. His scholarship focuses on how diverse people manipulated the environment of the Louisiana-Texas borderland in pursuit of individual and national ambitions. Prior to arriving at TCU, Jackson earned his bachelor's and master's degree from Jacksonville State University in Jacksonville, Alabama. So I hope you will join me in welcoming our 3 panelists, and I know, having read them, you will enjoy these papers. Thank you.
Wonderful, and I want to just echo previous speakers in thanking Adriana Lincoln, the American Philosophical Society, for bringing us together and hosting us today. What I'm going to do is not so much summarize the pre-circulated paper as try and give you some ideas on where I want to kind of develop this and how I want to take it forward to become an article. And I should say at the beginning that I am by training a Hispanist, and my dissertation and my first book project are concerned with how cartography and geography are used in the reform of the 18th century Spanish Empire. But in doing that work, I've run across a number of very curious individuals, and I tried to find a way to fit them into the project, but they didn't really live in that narrative. They didn't belong in a story about reform of the Spanish Empire because they lived between empires or were more native to the Atlantic world than to the story I was telling. And I'm starting to piece those individuals together in what I hope will become a second book project. And what I want to talk about today is one of those Spanish figures who doesn't really belong in a story about Spanish mapping, but in a story about how maps were used in early American republics. The joy of being a speaker on the last day is that I do not have to summarize for you too much about what's hopefully at this point become evident. There is a rich scholarship on the use of cartography in the American Revolution and the early Republic. It's been exciting to see more books come out in the last decade exploring this connection, and many of the eminent scholars who've written those books are in this room, so it would be a mistake for me to repeat their work to all of you. But I want to add to that story and maybe problematize the way in which we think about the way mapping created a sense of identity for the new American Republic. For me, I think especially of a quote from John Adams that I first encountered in Bernhard Baylin's Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, that the true revolution was in the hearts and minds of the people. And what better way to convey that sense of national identity, that revolution, than through cartographic images. That being said, I'm not going to show you a map today. I don't want to talk about a specific map. I want to talk about a surveying process and how the map was constructed, and more importantly for me, how it is being remembered by historians, or the stories we tell ourselves about the construction of these images that are images of a new nation, and who's included and who's excluded from those stories. So it probably makes sense to tell you what the survey I want to think about is, and it's this survey, which is called for in 1807, approved by a congressional act. Jefferson and Congress are in agreement that what they want is a survey of the Atlantic seaboard for defensive and commercial purposes. They agree that it's necessary, and the president is authorized to spend a sum of up to $50,000 to have a survey conducted of the eastern seaboard, to hire, quote, all intelligent persons necessary to see that survey through, and to buy instrumentation. And unsurprisingly, it goes through Congress quickly at a time that many acts of Congress were not being approved quickly, because there was rare agreement between both northern and southern representatives that this was for the national interest. Everyone agreed that there was a need for a coastal survey. And as soon as this act is approved, they turn to the American Philosophical Society because just 4 years earlier, it was the society which had helped prepare Lewis and Clark for their expedition to the West, and it was believed that the same individuals at the APS could oversee this effort, or at least identify individuals who would be able to direct it. Now, I want to tell you about my two kind of problematic actors here. One, if you've read the paper you're familiar with, is Jose de Ferrer. This is a gentleman I find endlessly fascinating, but who is more or less not in the historical scholarship. My Hispanist colleagues and I agree that he's fascinating. No one's found a place to put him, and he just doesn't exist in American scholarship, and I am troubled by that. He intersects with the American Republic in a number of ways. He's born to a kind of a middle class, to use the term anachronistically, family in Spain, and works for the Royal Company Guipuzcoa, trading between Caracas and Spain. He's actually 16 and on a boat doing that when he's intercepted by the British Navy and taken as a prisoner of war in retaliation for Spain's support of the American Revolution. In Great Britain, he receives a rudimentary cartographic education and then goes back to working for this trading company. But for the rest of his life, he will conduct informal surveys and astronomical observation more as a pursuit of personal pleasure than employment. And a theme of his life is that he will refuse repeatedly to work for any state as an official actor. He does spend time working at the observatories of Greenwich, Cadiz, and Paris, so the three major European meridians. He also spends time in Philadelphia. He surveys up and down the Atlantic seaboard and is a friend through scientific and commercial interests with many people at the APS. The other individual is Ferdinand Hassler, who will end up actually directing the Coastal Survey. Born in Switzerland, he works for a Swiss trigonometric survey before he comes to the United States, is a lecturer in mathematics at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And when this call for a survey comes out, his good friend, Albert Gallatin, also Swiss, as we know, recommends that Hassler, from his experience doing the trigonometric survey in Switzerland, might be the person to direct the effort. The difference between the two of them, and that's quite interesting, is that Hassler doesn't think it'll be possible to survey the very small inlets of the Atlantic seaboard. He doesn't have a methodology for doing so. He claims that the jagged nature of the Atlantic seaboard prevents a coastal survey, while Ferrer, having surveyed many of these places, in particular Cape Hook, Henlopen, Sandy Hook, and then down by the Outer Banks, has a methodology that he proposes for how these areas could be surveyed properly. However, when his proposal is circulated to John Vaughan, who then sends it to Robert Patterson, to Albert Gallatin, to Andrew Ellicott, all at the APS, Vaughan is forced to admit that Ferrer will not stay and oversee the survey based on his methodology, that he refuses to give up his employment as a commercial agent. He wants to travel back and forth between Europe and the New World, and he won't stay and oversee the effort. It doesn't really matter what he wants to do anyway, because the United States does not have the finances to conduct the survey in 1807. They also don't have instrumentation. Hassler is directed to lead the coastal survey. He goes to Great Britain to buy instruments and gets stranded there by the War of 1812 and doesn't return until 1816 when he starts the coastal survey, curiously using Ferrer's methodology, which explains how to survey all of these inlets that Hassler had claimed were impossible to map. So you might ask, why am I so interested in this methodology and these two figures? Well, Hassler's received quite a bit of fame as the director of this survey. NOAA takes the Coastal Survey to be their originating scientific project. This is their, they take that map to be their baby photo. This is who they are and what they were made out of. And they have a wonderful historical biography of Hassler, championing him, his genius, and how he led this survey. Similarly, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the current federal agency which replaces the Bureau of Bureau and Weights that Hassler led, also champions Hassler as a savant who had directed this survey. And I apologize to the curators in the room, but to quote from a curator's note on an exhibition of instruments at NIST, his plan for triangulation was superior to the other plans submitted by, quote, native surveyors, and that a little bit more problematic for me, in the 1830s, the same decade that de Tocqueville and other European visitors were taking the measure of the young American Republic in a figurative sense, Hassler was measuring it quite literally. Now, he does direct the survey, and I don't mean to take any credit away from him, but nowhere in the biographies of Hassler or the surveys, historical scholarship, is anyone else mentioned. Ferrer's name is completely absent, save for the records here at the American Philosophical Society that have his original plan and the correspondence of Vaughan and Pattinson and Gallatin saying that it was the superior plan and should be used to conduct this survey. And I think we need to reinsert his work into the way we think about this originating survey of the coast, this first map, this beginning of NOAA, which was not a purely a American project. And I'll end by just saying, if I had to conclude why is Ferrer absent, he refused to sustain the United States. Once he leaves in 1807, he actually never comes back. Hassler never goes back to Switzerland after he comes and directs the survey here. He becomes a naturalized citizen, director of the Bureau of Weights, Measures. There's a NOAA scientific vessel named after him, and he stays here. And so he makes a more convenient father of NOAA than a itinerant Spanish geographer and merchant who might have been a gifted geographer, but had no allegiance or identity tied to the young American Republic. Thank you.
I would just like to begin by echoing everybody else and thanking the APS for hosting this great conference and for everyone for attending these panels. They've been wonderful sessions and tough acts to follow. And for me, it was, I think it was when I was walking from the train station to the hotel on Thursday, when it struck me that I was coming to Philadelphia, old Philadelphia, the heart of American independence, the cradle of the creation of the United States, and I was going to ask everyone in the room to pause for a second and think about Canada. And you laugh, and that's okay. But then I thought, this makes sense, because at the time of independence and the creation of the United States, the people who were performing those things were also spending a lot of time thinking about Canada. So what I would like to do with my time today is two things. The first is to explore the world in which Jedidiah Morse lived before he wrote some of his textbooks. This is not covered in the paper. And the second is to look at those textbooks, those geographic textbooks that he did write, and how they reflected that world that he lived in. And Morse is considered the father of American geography, and his textbooks are understood as helping to fashion a sense of American nationalism and American identity. And I don't disagree, but I want us to recognize that American nationalism and American identity at the time required and demanded a very deep engagement with parts of North America that did not join the revolution and did not participate in the creation of a nation-building project. And I don't have any slides. I'm only going to ask you to imagine two images. One of them is a map. The second is a person, so it shouldn't be terribly difficult. Morse is familiar to many as the author of these important textbooks, but I'd like to start with someone who will be familiar to everybody, and I think is particularly fitting given where we are, and that's Benjamin Franklin. I'm always cautious about talking about Benjamin Franklin in a room full of people who spend more time with him than I do, but it may be a surprise for some of you to know that Franklin had a not terribly mild obsession with Canada. When he arrived, and this obsession with Canada shaped his idea of the revolution and the process of creating the United States. When he arrived in Paris in 1776, and here I want you to imagine the image of Franklin wearing his marten fur cap, He wore that hat to announce himself as an American. He had been to France twice before, and when he was there, he wore powdered wigs, he dressed like a European. This time was different. He was representing the United Colonies, and he used this wig to demonstrate that he was now an American. He used the hat, the Martinford hat, to announce that he was an American. He got that hat in Canada. He got that hat while on a trip to Montreal as a commissioner during the invasion, the American invasion of Quebec, during the Revolution. And he thought it made it look like he was an American, but he also looked like a French-Canadian coureur de bois, or maybe a very elderly Hudson's Bay Company trapper. But he persisted with this idea of Canada through his time in Paris. During the Paris negotiations, Franklin was obsessed with getting Canada. He suggested to British negotiators that it would be very embarrassing for them if the United Colonies demanded that they give up Canada, and that the British government then did. So he suggested, wouldn't it be so much better for you optically if you just voluntarily surrendered Canada so it could join the colonies? This didn't happen. And the idea of Canada sort of fell away when Franklin got sick near the ends of the negotiations, and Jay and Adams just wanted to get all the loose ends tied up. So we had in 1783 this peace, but Canada remained kind of important to the idea of independence and the United Colonies. 1783 brought the recognition of independence, but not yet a nation. These were independent states governed by the Articles of Confederation. These articles sort of ensured that the states had sovereignty and independence, and gave the central government loose and not terribly effective powers. And they had some articles that seem recognizable to us, including what would happen if a new state wanted to join or a new colony wanted to join. So the idea was that if anyone new wants to join, at least 9 of the independent states have to agree. But there was one exception in Article 11, and that was Canada could join whenever it wanted. It simply had to decide that it wanted to become part of the Union, and it would be admitted. So even crafting these documents, these sort of foundational, what we see now as nation-building documents, understood that Canada and Quebec were important parts of that process. So shortly after this, Jedidiah Morse writes one of his first textbooks. It is an instructional book called Geography Made Easy. And here I want you to imagine a map, which we've actually seen before, but it's illustrated with Amos Doolittle's A New Map of the United States. This map of the United States includes a top third, which is Canada and Nova Scotia. They are colored similarly to all of the other states. They include the same kinds of information, usually just names of rivers and indigenous nations. Really no way of indicating that they are different and do not belong to the United Colonies that have declared independence. In 1789, Jedidiah Morse writes The American Geography. This is a book that gets high praise from people like George Washington. It offers its readers a tour of the United States. They go through each colony, they get a little bit of information about both. Close to the end, we have entries on the British provinces, and they are described as you might imagine them. He uses words like frozen, barren. He discusses Quebec as having no elected assembly, governed by the Quebec Act, so sort of this military-type government. This is important for Americans to know because they are different than Quebec. Understanding what made Americans American made them required that they understood how they were different from these sort of imperial pasts that existed just on their northern border. In 1793, by this point, Morse's textbooks have sold well. He's become increasingly wealthy and successful. He authors something called the American Universal Geography. This book, in the title, says it is calculated for Americans. But he's made several changes. One of the main changes is the architecture of the book is reversed. So before his American students learn about their states, they have to take a tour through British North America. So they're going to go through Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, the Canadas. He's kind of doing this geographically from north to south, but it has this impact on the way that the book is understood. Morse had also changed his interpretation of these British colonies. He looks now at Quebec and sees a lot to like. In 1791, Quebec was split in two to become Upper Canada and Lower Canada. Both now had assemblies. He talks about Montreal in very favorable terms. It's no longer cold. It turns out that the cool air is actually quite clear and enjoyable and healthy. And Canadians seem to thrive in the winter. He has lots of nice things to say. In part, I think this is Morse, as a New England Federalist, seeing a lot that he recognizes and likes in the British provinces, especially when compared to things that he sees and does not like in Southern American states. What he is accounting for is the fact that loyalists who left the American Revolution and fled to the British provinces continued a lot of the revolutionary spirit. They made demands on the British Empire, demands like dividing giant provinces in half. This happens in Nova Scotia to create New Brunswick in 1784, which becomes smaller. Elected assemblies have more authority over a drastically reduced bit of land. Quebec itself split in two so that there's the French part and the English part. That makes it a whole lot easier for New England Protestant missionary types to get behind the project now that the French Catholics have their own little enclave. But he's recognizing, in fact, that a lot of the goals of early revolutionary patriots were recognized in British North America, and a lot of the ills that happened after the American Revolution had not yet appeared in the same way in the British provinces. So Jedidiah Morse was the father of American geography, but he, like most living in the independent colonies and later the United States, lived in a world where it was often expected that one would look beyond the nation's borders to help understand the nation itself. Thank you.
How's everyone doing today? So, saving the best for last, right? No, it's been a pleasure to be here and to speak here. I never thought that I would end up speaking at the American Philosophical Society, so it's crazy how life works. So today, I hope that this talk provides you with a bit of a lagniappe, and Penelope might enjoy my use of that word. So it means a little extra gift. So today, I hope to provide you some information about an area that you probably don't know much about. And so I'm going to be talking about William Darby, and he was a surveyor in the Orleans Territory between 1805 and 1815. And Darby he's born on the Pennsylvania frontier in 1775, and he ends up traversing his way to, he aspires to be a wealthy plantation owner. And so he works his way to Natchez in 1798, and then he loses everything. It's a very sad story, and so he moves but to sum it up very quickly, he moves to Opelousas in Louisiana, or what is now today Louisiana, and he becomes a surveyor for the for the land office there. So he begins to chart the Atchafalaya Basin and the Opelousas Parish, and he comes up with this idea that, hey, I can make a lot of money if I create this map of the Orleans Territory and then sell it, right? So he's trying to latch on to this map craze that is just beginning to emerge in the United States. And as you can see with the image here, this is the map that he ends up creating. And there is this huge geopolitical turmoil that he surveys and designs this map. And so that's what I really want to focus on today. So we're going to switch to the Louisiana Purchase, all right, 1803. All that the Purchase guarantees is that the United States has the old French territories west of the Mississippi and the Isle of Orleans. And I'm showing you this map here because Thomas Jefferson envisions this Louisiana Purchase as including all of the land between the Perdido River and the Rio Grande. And so it's, there's been many pens that have run out of ink trying to answer all of the questions that surround this definition of the Louisiana Purchase, or his idea of what the limits of Louisiana. And so I just want you to understand that Americans are claiming this huge swath of territory, and there's not really a solid argument for any of it, right? And so we know that, but now we're going to zoom in on the Sabine River. And this claim of the Rio Grande, the United States and Spain are continuously contesting one another, trying to advance their land claims, and it really focuses in on this Sabine River kind of corridor. And this is an area that is, there's only one city there today that is of any note, and it's Lake Charles. And so it's only 60,000 people. So this region is shaped by this contest to form this border. And in 1806, Jefferson with his scientific, so you have Lewis and Clark, you have the Hunter and Dunbar, and then the Freeman and Custis expedition, and then Zebulon Pike is sponsored by Wilkinson. But the Freeman and Custis expedition ascends the Red River, and the best way to think of it is that it's this attempt to acquire knowledge of this area. And so when you are able to acquire knowledge, you can stake a stronger. So Jefferson sees it as a way to strengthen the United States' claim to this western territory. But the Freeman and Custis expedition, as they ascend the Red River, are stopped by a Spanish patrol under the leadership of Francisco Villena, and they are turned around back to Natchitoches. And when they arrive back in Natchitoches, the saber rattling is, you can't underestimate how William Claiborne, who's the governor of Orleans Territory, is trying to use this as an excuse to start a war with Spain. It's the perfect opportunity for a land grab to go to, for those of you that don't understand, so Texas, there's only 2 settlements there at the time. You have Nacogdoches and then San Antonio de Bejar. And these are the only 2 settlements of note. And so the United States could easily, if they had a large armed force, the idea that American leaders think is that they can easily advance these claims all the way to the Rio Grande. So James Wilkinson, though, the famed double agent, right? He arrives in October, so he's about 2 months late for this move for war. So everything is calmed down, and Wilkinson gets there, and he takes the army, and he marches through the Sabine River. He's going to, make this great stand, and he discusses with the Spanish commander, Lieutenant Colonel Simón de Herrera, and they decide to create this neutral ground agreement. And so it creates this space. You can see it in yellow on the map, and it is a region outside of the sovereign control of either Spain or the United States. And this is going to create a lot of issues that neither of these guys could have anticipated, because bandits and runaway slaves, Native American tribes are going to manipulate this space to further their own ambitions. And I just want to point out the eastern boundary is the Arroyo Hondo, which is this. It is a great natural boundary. So it's very, very hard to cross it. All right. So Darby, when he creates his map, or when he envisions this project in 1808, these are the existent maps, and you can see Barthélemy Lafon's map of Louisiana on your left, I guess, or on your right. We had this conversation yesterday, right? Disorienting. But Lafon's map has the cartouche placed in that southwestern quadrant to mask the fact that he has no geographic knowledge or data concerning this area. And then Matthew Carey, 1814, produces this map of Louisiana, and you can see the same exact, there's no information in that southwest quadrant, right? There's one river that they draw, so it's completely blank. And so Darby sees this as an opportunity to, if he can map this by creating this cartographic knowledge of the region, then the United States can begin to assert control or authority over this area. Now, Darby he does this map for 3 reasons, all right? Number 1, for his own wallet. He views this as a way to make money. Number 2, he thinks that he can enhance his own scientific or intellectual reputation. So maybe he can move back to Philadelphia and get into the American Philosophical Society, all right? And so Darby, he has these 2 motivations, but then in 1812, the story changes. And that is when their bill of annexation into the Union is accepted. And the state claims the Sabine River as its western boundary. So I showed you the neutral ground, and so the state just claims all that territory. And so Darby now sees it as a way that he can add to this American expansion. And I just want to highlight a few geographical facts. And so Darby takes off on this expedition, and in 1811 he surveys the northern reaches, so the 33rd parallel, over to the Mississippi River and down. And then after statehood, he decides that, okay, I've got to go map the Sabine River. And in 1836, he leaves one quote. This is the only quote I'm going to tell you today. And he believes that he is the first person or first individual with any civilized object in view when he finds the Sabine River. And that's I could have spent the entire time just trying to break down that quote because there's so many complexities that it brings with it. But so he navigates, he goes around the Red River Raft, and for those of you that don't know, it's 60 miles of a blockage in the Red River Channel. And so it takes them, the United States, it ends up taking them like 70 years to clear it. So they thought it would be a quick, easy project, but, government spending, it got a little elongated, needless to say. So this is the Sabine River. And so when he navigates around the Red River, he's going to visit the homes of a lot of influential settlers in this western region who are all Spanish or Creole. But it's a way to see that he's connecting these people through his survey, his physical survey. So it relies on all of this knowledge from Native Americans, from French Creoles, from Spaniards. And so it's really taking all of this information and putting it into a map that illustrates the United States extending sovereignty. So he goes down the Sabine River, and this is a picture today, so obviously it looked very different at the time. But I just want to give you an idea of what he's sailing down, what he's marking this river, and he charts its course. And what we're going to get to here in just a minute is you'll notice the western boundary has a completely different look from the Cary map that we saw. It's very north-south, right? And here's a picture of the Calcasieu. And so this is that western boundary. And so his survey completely changes the cartographic image of Louisiana. And you can see how it, the river snakes east and then goes back northwest. And so it changes this cartographic image. And it's a way of attaching Louisiana to, or this western border to American control, or asserting the scientific authority over it. And so here's another a zoomed-in region. And I just want to point out that John Malesh, as everyone knows, the famous compiler, right? So he takes Darby's map in 1816, and he takes his survey notes, and he's going to be the guy who publishes it. And Louisiana has a very different appearance, right? So Malesh takes Darby's map and throws it in there, and Darby is so upset because he felt that Malesh shorted him. He didn't include a footnote to him. He plagiarized his work. But it changes this image of Louisiana, and we don't see this neutral ground region. And so it's a way of interpreting the United States as annexing this contested boundary despite not having a legal claim to it until the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1821. And so it's important to think of that Adams-Onis, or the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819, as defining the Louisiana Purchase. And so with that, I'll show you one more image of the map. And I hope you enjoyed my talk, and thank you. So.
Well, alas, I have no visuals. I feel bereft of that. First, I too want to thank the organizers of this conference, in particular Adriana, for inviting me to participate, and to the panelists for the pleasure of reading your smart, fascinating narratives and of seeing how well they intersect. Appropriately, this panel is called Beyond the Nation. All three papers, I think, demonstrate what I like to think of as an international history of the early republic. And what I mean by that is that collectively they remind us that, one, the territorial outline of the United States was drawn out of the broader map of British North America. Two, that Americans defining history was as colonial subjects within a far-flung British Empire. and as Britons. 3, that this newly born early American republic defined its principles and policies in dialogue with the transatlantic politics and cultural exchanges, including rival European colonial interests contesting American national boundaries. And I think, Jackson, you had a lovely map where it was sort of, you had, the British possessions and the Spanish. So keep that visual in mind. And lastly, that Americans' ambitions to create a modern revision of empire, an empire for liberty, as Thomas Jefferson called it, was built upon the cherished homelands of native nations. Now, all 3 papers also highlight, I think, obviously the central place of geographers to defining American national edges, both the boundaries of national character as well as those of sovereign territorial claims. The importance of these geographers suggests, too, the profound faith of early Republicans in scientific empiricism and in the textual abstractions of printed maps to engender a kind of rational order and certainty in the midst of a much more contentious politics, dynamic social mobility, and much more porous boundaries. Now, I'm a historian, so reflexively, I'm not going to go in order of the papers as they were given, but in fact, in chronological order. Jeffers explores Connecticut Federalist Jedidiah Morse's geographic textbooks in the 1780s and early 1790s, and particularly Morse's inclusion of British Canadian provinces, information with which his readers could engage intellectually with their imperial past, and in so doing, imagine an American future, as Jeffers puts it, or in other words, that they could conceive of their own distinct national identity emergent from and in contrast to the remaining British possessions in North America. Notably, Morse had to keep writing new versions, I love that fact, by the way, of his textbook in response to shifting boundaries and the geographic confusion that defined the endlessly complex and harried transformations of 13 independent colonies into, we'll call it a confederation at best, and then eventually a federation, and all this amidst ongoing hostilities and eventually wars. With Indian nations and confederations of Indian nations. Additionally, the foil of the British Canadian provinces toward Americans forming a distinct national character proved problematic, given that Anglo-Canadians, at least, proved insufficiently other, not least because there was movement across, frequent movement across the boundaries, particularly with American loyalists relocating to Canada. But also Anglo-Canadians were not so culturally different in any case from Anglo-Americans, and certainly from congressional New Englanders like Jedidiah Morse. And also, as political reforms in the provinces permitted a kind of more representative governments, at least one that was more akin to Federalist ideals, they seemed all the less other. I did wonder, as I was reading this, of course, the place of French Canadians as opposed to Anglo-Canadians in terms of this contrast. I think Jeffers does a wonderful job here of doing the exact kind of international history I'm talking about. And he answers the problem of these affinities by noting that British subjects and American citizens were in the process of determining how they differed from each other. And I want to ask you, as you expand on this, to enlarge on what you mean here, and also the dialogic pursuit of nation-making, requiring a balancing of external influences and internal cohesion. Now that I think would be really helpful, but I may be actually off-roading you on that endeavor in my next response, because I want to encourage you, or I'd suggest a modification in your contention that Canada served as a foil for the formation of an American national identity, to thinking in terms of a dual American perspective as citizens of a post-colonial republic and Republican proprietors of a domestic empire. From this dual perspective, Americans perceive Canada both in terms of their fellow Euro-American Creole inhabitants and settler colonists, and with the eyes of imperial competitors to Britain for these northwestern lands. If anything, it enhances, I think, the importance of Canada, allows it to be both a political alternative and a potential extension to the formation of the early republic and its empire for liberty. Now, roughly 14 years, oh goodness, I'm running out of time. All right, so I'm just gonna quickly jump here. I really thought Matthew's paper, again, offered much more, actually, than he promised. You said you were going to show us the Spanish imprint through Farrar on the the first U.S. coastal survey. In fact, I think what you're offering is much, much bigger than that, and I think you suggested that as well when you were talking about these people who don't fit and who sort of occupy different a different kind of, I guess, spatial belonging. And I would like to encourage you to be bolder in your argument from one of a kind of recovery of Farrar to offering out an alternative Atlantic world framing against a focus on nations, whether Spain or the United States, to someone who I think nicely signifies what Karen Wolf's call for a vast early America, one that takes in altogether, to borrow a paper title of Farrar's, the geographical position of various places in the United States and other parts of North America, or even vacating the American nation state entirely, as Farrar does in another paper title, the geographical position of sundry places in North America and the West Indies. For besides his cosmopolitan geographic science and his import-export business across the Americas, Farrar looks up at the skies for comets and astronomical observations to map his geographical positions across this vast early America. In other words, Farrar took in this vast early America in terms of longitudinal and latitudinal breadth, from the stars to the coastlines and maritime trade in those sundry places of North America, the West Indies, Cuba, Madrid, ports, Creole plantations in Venezuela, and I think, actually, as I investigated his company, both Guyana and the Philippines as well. Jackson has provided us with a third geographer and surveyor designating the edges of American sovereignty. Western settler William Darby toiled on the southwestern edges of the Louisiana Purchase. I'm so glad, Jackson, you showed how rough that was, because it seemed quite clear that this guy really toiled. Unlike Farrar, he was bushwhacking it and going on foot and self-supporting his investigations. And so in contrast to our prior geographers, the upright Connecticut Congregationalist Morse and the Spanish merchant and cosmopolitan scientist Farrar, the middling clerk and surveyor Darby labored to produce a definitive map of the state of Louisiana, primarily to escape ever-present financial debt, a bane he never freed himself of, and despite having produced a really the first detailed and accurate map of Louisiana based on meticulous field studies. But I think that is the historical significance of Darby and of his map. that it rested in its conferring scientific legitimacy to the unlawful western boundary of the state set out in the Louisiana Constitution, while those coordinates followed a series of opportunist actions that Jackson mentioned. I think that Darby's map of Louisiana the legitimacy of that map and of that boundary derived from Darby's painstaking fieldwork, his precise details, the accuracy of parts of Louisiana never before mapped. In other words, his empirical precision, new discoveries, and rigor conferred legitimacy, and perhaps even a kind of objectivity on what was essentially an annexation and a land grab, making all the more de facto, that is, from deeds, the annexation of disputed lands by Louisiana and by Congress, which accepted the terms of the Louisiana Constitution. So I will leave you with that, and thank you again to the panelists.
Would you like to respond?
I could respond very quickly. French Canadians are a problem for the Patriots because they simply will not rebel against the British, and the Patriots find it infuriating. I think the dual American concept is a great way to think of it because the British provinces are at times familiar enough that they should just join the United States, but that at other times can be described as so different that it is a useful foil. And as far as creating identities on both sides of the border, I think all I can say is that other than hockey, debating what a Canadian is the national pastime in Canada, so that has not yet been resolved and is still very much a process that dates back to this era.
Thanks for your three great papers. I have a question and a comment for Matthew, and then a question for Jeffers. The comment for Matthew, I just thought reading the paper, when you're talking about Ferrer's methodology, a diagram would really go a long way to helping readers who don't know the intricacies of cartography and scientific mapping. So anyway, just a thought. I guess my question for you is, what do you see as, I guess I want to push you on kind of elucidating what's at stake in this guy being Spanish, or Hispanic in particular. And I think maybe thinking counterfactually here would be a helpful exercise. Who else could the APS have asked to do this? Is there particular knowledge from Spanish cartographic practices that this guy is using in particular that somebody else couldn't have brought to this project? So I don't know, just I think that might help you get where you're going a little bit. Jeffers, there were two sentences that really have stuck out to me in your paper. The very last one, Morse's projects could not ignore early Canada, so on and so forth. And then on page 7 to 8, after over 470 pages, readers reach the British Dominion, and we learn that they get a page each. So it kind of seems to me like that's exactly what's happening, is that they are kind of being ignored comparatively. So I guess my first question is, in other editions, do these guys get a little bit more airtime, more pages? But I don't know, it seems like maybe the fact that these guys barely get any text suggests that there's a minimalization rather than this is some kind of preoccupation. So I guess just the question, because I think what you're doing that's interesting is this back and forth on what the perspective is on these guys to the north, right? And so I just wonder if perhaps a little quantitative thinking might also help bring that story to the forefront. Thanks.
Thank you for both the comment and the question. The comment is absolutely well taken. I will include, and I have plenty of fun little diagrams from surveying manuals that are used to instruct people at the Academy of Naval Cadets in Spain, which are not just illustrative, but kind of fun because they're ridiculous illustrations of people falling off of boats with instruments in hand. As to your question, what's at stake with him being Spanish? I think two things. One is I try to stay close to my actors, but I would be lying if I didn't admit that there's kind of a alternative impulse for me to highlight the Spanish aspects of early America, and that Hispanic culture has always been a part of this country, and that Spanish migrants into this country predate the creation of this country. But as to where the methodology comes from, in his time at Greenwich and also at the Academy of Naval Cadets in Cadiz, Ferrer's learning these coastal surveying methodologies. And in particular, he learns from Vicente Tofino in Spain, who's just done a coastal survey of the Iberian Peninsula, this methodology for surveying the coastline. By comparison, Hassler's cartographic education is really land-based surveying in Switzerland, and he hasn't done the sort of coastal work that Ferrer has, and that's a very short answer as to why they have two different approaches to doing this survey. There are plenty of people with cartographic knowledge in the United States who could have contributed to this sort of effort. Why the two of them happen to be reached out to as opposed to other surveyors, I think is a bigger question of privilege and access and familiarity between merchants and men of certain backgrounds at the APS. But I think just highlighting the way in which this one person who has traveled through the Atlantic world and learned surveying technologies and practiced them at a number of different national contexts, how he was able to solve this particular problem is enough for now.
Very quickly, thank you for the suggestion. And I look at Morse's depiction of the British provinces sort of over the three textbooks that I am exploring for this piece. And they do get longer. They get exponentially longer. And to be fair, in the first one, Vermont only gets a little bit more than Quebec. So he's putting more attention to places that belonged in the Confederacy. But so the quantitative part is important, but he's also, he has nice things to say about Montreal, and he says some pretty nasty things about places like Williamsburg. So he is also sort of measuring, I think, an interpretation of what's happening in these places. But you're right that I think one of the interesting strands here is that the British provinces get more attention as this American identity is in the process of formation.
Thank you all for sharing this work. As Bethel noted, all of these papers focus on the relationship between places of American power and places that Americans at the time might have regarded might have regarded as peripheral to those centers, whether that's the coast, British North America, or Texas and Louisiana. At the same time, all of these papers seem interested in mobility and the way that subjects move, and whether they're moving along the coast and at sea, into Canada or across the Atlantic, or up and down rivers. And I'm curious if each of you could talk more about whether the relationship between center and periphery is a useful way of framing your investigations, and whether mobility helps us understand anything about that relationship.
I'll offer the first attempt to delve into that. And the center-periphery, when you look at cartographic production, I think that the center-periphery model does offer valuable insights in that Darby creates this map to publish it in Philadelphia for this learned community of kind of American elites. And so he views that as the way that he can enhance, his reputation and increase his wealth. And so it's helpful for thinking that they're sending this knowledge back to a center. However, all of its production relies on local physical action. And so we have to remember that Darby is one of other surveyors. They're physically doing this and largely on their own initiative, own support system. And so we just have to remember that these guys, create it in the periphery, so you can't think of it as, you have to think of the periphery as a center for action. That's what I'll just leave it at that. So I'm going to argue both ways with that,
Thank you for the question. Jedidiah Morse definitely thought he was in the center. His vision of an American identity was spreading New England as far as he could, and the values of New England. I personally am not a center and periphery person. I think the interesting stuff happens in between, where the kind of hardened ideas of a self get weaker the closer you are to someone who's very different. And it's also important to keep in mind that even in the 1780s, most of the places outside of north of New England and a lot of New England, the center is actually the indigenous homeland. And that's Jedidiah Morse really struggles with recognizing that. He tries, but there's problems with like the font size, and he's never super particular with where you should write Iroquois. So I think the center periphery has done a lot for imperial studies. I think the interesting stuff is in the middle.
Yeah, I would have trouble thinking about how to address a center and periphery in this story and stay in the kind of narrative structure that I'm trying to employ. I would say Ferrer is certainly a person who doesn't think of a center and periphery, but of multiple centers, and he spends time at a number of these places in his life. Just to return to the surveying methodology, the heart of the problem is that, again, it's what happens in between centers. There's no question about how you're going to accurately chart New York or Newark or Norfolk or the Chesapeake. These are places that have been mapped the mouth of the Chesapeake. These are places that have been mapped. The problem that Hassler can't solve, that Ferrer offers a solution to, is how to deal with a smaller, what are considered backwaters or challenging kind of swampy inlets. And so it's solving that problem that Ferrer kind of gets entryway into the survey. And I think all I would say to this is it is really curious that problem is prioritized by the Coastal Survey and by people at the APS, that they see some benefit to addressing those smaller inlets, and they're really working hard to find someone who can offer them a methodology that thinks about those places in between the centers on the coastline. But thank you.
My question's for Jackson. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on this idea of the neutral ground. It seems to me that you maybe could be even more expansive in how you're using it and not just apply it to this one small region, but think about maybe the whole Gulf Coast this time as a neutral ground. I'm thinking of a number of different political movements that happened at the time, such as William Augustus Bowles, Creek Republic, the Republic of West Florida, and even later on the Republic of Texas. And it seems to me that everyone is trying to make something out of the Gulf Coast, and these people aren't, they're not really imperial people. They're people who are living on the ground and trying to make something out of this neutral area. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on how we could maybe think about the whole region as a neutral ground, or if you think it just doesn't work at all.
I think that's a great point. The entire Gulf Coast is a contested region from 1783 basically until 1821. And even after that, you could argue until the 1840s with the Seminole conflicts that continue in Florida. The neutral ground, the reason why I define it in the Sabine Corridor is because James Wilkinson and Simón de Herrera, they coined that term as the neutral ground agreement between themselves. And so that's why I use it to refer to the specific area, because that's how they defined it. And I think it does pose useful concepts that we can look at other areas as neutral. I won't make my claim yet. Obviously, I'm early in my project, so I'm not going to make these huge claims, at this point in time. But I think that it does offer parallels that go to other regions in the Gulf Coast. And there is a good historiography of this region as contested space where there are fluid identities and loyalties in this time. And so I think it's something to look for, but I wouldn't say that the neutral ground is necessarily an apt term to apply everywhere else, just because of the nature of its, how they define it themselves.
Okay, I have one last quick question in the back.
Okay, this is a really quick question. Your presentation was wonderful, all of you. I've learned so much. But what we do know is that maps are powerful. So what I'd like to know from all of you, one of you, any of you, looking at the power of maps, we know with war, maps always change because land is gained or lost. So looking at that power and using the old maps and the new technology of maps and so forth, can any of you predict the next major war, when it could be, where it could be, and how the map may change? Just a prediction.
Well, there hasn't been an invasion of Canada since 1812, so I think maybe we're due. But no, I don't think I can. But I think.
Somewhat jokingly, but somewhat not, I'll jump off of Anders and say, well, I think there's many regions we could think about, but one problem is the unmapped. Due to climatic change, we have land and resources that are being exposed, especially in the Arctic region, and who owns those resources, that is certainly the source of conflict. I like to tell my students in my history of cartography survey, we talk about how mapping technologies and land claims never go away. And I think it was in 2004, Putin sent a submarine under the Arctic cap with a Russian flag made of titanium that he planted. Now, he's going back to Roman law, the idea of claiming ownership through planting a flag in that way. But I think in all regions where previously unreachable resources are being exposed due to climate change, there will be competition for those resources, and I think we can all agree, let's hope it's not violent and armed competition.
I'll add one comment to this, and I would encourage everyone to, I think right now, actually with Turkey going into Syria in the last few days, that is another place that you can see the map could potentially be redrawn. And also to look at India and Pakistan, because this contested region, these countries are trying to redefine their own territoriality. And so I think that it could be extremely useful for us to look at these regions and see how these maps are, I believe that they will change within the next decade.
Great. Well, this seems like a good occasion to invite back up our commenters and also Patrick Spiro. But as they're coming up, let's thank our panelists.
There we have three distinguished APS members that have been hiding behind the PowerPoint presentation for this whose names have appeared. Actually, surprisingly, Washington's name has not appeared much in many of this discussion or the papers, but obviously Jefferson has, and Franklin has loomed large. I think Bob Hauser's going to join us as well to make it a foursome up here. And at the end of these conferences, we like to just have a wrap-up session to try and distill some of the things that have emerged over the course of the past 2 days, and maybe some of the things that didn't emerge but are worth discussion. And I think I was actually going to use my librarian's prerogative to make a comment as a follow-up to the question that just happened. And that's, I always get asked, what is the relevance of of studying history? How is it relevant? How is it useful? And in fact, I think your question made me think about how thinking back on the past few days can help us think about the present and the future. And one of the things that emerged, and it was in Jackson's comment, is where we see contested borders. That's usually a site of potential violence and warfare, that's a red flag, that when people are looking at maps and arguing over where these lines are supposed to be or not be, or where these geographies, who owns these geographies, it's a red flag for potential warfare. But also, thinking a little bit more on Christian Kutz's papers and Max's comment about disorder and order, in some ways, the more precise the maps appear to be, perhaps the more order there is. And that's where the emergence of new territories that are going to be contested are, because they are unmapped territory. And so that too is a potential red flag for future wars. But as we wrap up this session, or these 2 days, I just wanted to ask the panel a couple of very general questions, and after they comment, to see if the audience themselves have any comments themselves. So my first question, actually, since Bob summarized the key themes so well this morning, I usually like to ask what the key themes are, but that's already been established. So the second one is, what have we missed? What themes haven't been discussed that you would have anticipated hearing about, or that it was a missed opportunity for whatever reason? And that's for any of you. Or all of you.
Well,
all of you.
I've seen some beautiful images of cartography, and this is one of the reasons I liked my mid-career switch from economic history to history of cartography. That's a lot more fun to teach it and to go to conferences and see all these images. But as someone who works on digital visualization and tries to incorporate that into map history, I think maybe a missed thing was talking about how we produce a new kind of scholarship based on our interest in place, space, geography, and cartography. So I don't have any, I have my own experiments and my own platforms that I work on, but I'd certainly be interested in hearing what other people think about the best way to convey this new knowledge that we're generating through this kind of inquiry in a different kind of form, because I guess I just find it hard to believe that the next book I publish that deals with maps is going to be published the way the last one was, as a kind of a hard text with maybe a supplementary website. I think these two worlds are going to be integrated a lot more closely, and those of us who can do this work are going to be well positioned to advance that. I'd love to hear what people are working on digitally with map history.
Yeah, that's a good comment. Yeah, well, I think one of the big questions is what exactly can you do with a map? And I think a lot of what we saw in this conference was people interrogating them as representations, especially, right? But what about as repositories for data to do work on historical geography, right? And here we might think about a term that's come up a lot over the course of these 3 days, which is accuracy. And though the concept has come up, I think it's kind of been used a little cavalierly. And so one of the things I think that's been missing is just how do we define this exactly? Are we talking about our own senses of accuracy in the 21st century? Are we talking about these historical actors and their perceptions of accuracy? And I think I'd also draw a distinction between precision and accuracy. Precision being the degree the degree of accuracy that somebody is looking for, versus accuracy, which is kind of the right and wrong or deviation from what is what is right. But I think just to come back to what can we do with computers? What can we do to either reach new audiences or to find patterns that we weren't able to see before, because just the human eye can only make so much sense of certain kinds of things, to see patterns, to aggregate data, to aggregate different kinds of data together. I think that was the really wonderful thing from our keynote speaker, and I definitely would have liked to see more of it. But I think those projects are intensive, right? They require multiple kinds of expertise. You need to be adept at reading the historical map, but you also have to understand statistics and statistical analysis in a spatial context, which is kind of different than other kinds of statistical analysis. You need to have a knowledge of, how to make a database and how to do that effectively. And, so it just, that's a lot of different areas of expertise, right? So I think maybe one future thing for us to be thinking about is how can we create collaboration between people with different kinds of expertise, and I think the APS is definitely could be a good home for that. I don't know. So I've kind of said a lot at this point, so I'll I certainly could say other things too, but I'll pass it off to anybody else who Bethel, do you want to say anything here?
I don't really, I mean, I guess maybe thinking more broadly about what constitutes a map beyond a traditional sense of a map. For instance, there's a lot of work that's about mapping the body, tattoos and markings and so forth. There's also work on indigenous senses, ways of indicating space, and it's a very different. I was actually thinking about that in terms of neutral ground, because that does have more specific meanings. So different forms of mapping I could see as a possible new theme to add. I had thought of one other, but now I've forgotten what it was. So I'll just pass this on.
So, unfortunately, I can't show you the visuals that I've managed to bring up to prompt myself on my PC here. But I would point to two maps that I think are really quite marvelous and inspiring, that at least one of which might might have appeared at this conference or one like it. The other of which is really quite different from anything that we saw here, because all of the maps that we discussed were in some sense efforts to portray actual territory. So the first one, and you can look these up on the web, they're easy to find, was written by, prepared by a guy named Hergesheimer, along with another guy whose name has come up here from time to time, Alexander Dallas Bache. It was prepared in 1861, and it shows a map. It's a map of the American South based on data from the census of 1860, which showed in dark colors, or darker or shades, the location of slaves. And it was, I don't know whether, Patrick and I have been discussing whether we can find out easily whether we own a copy of it. Apparently it was produced in profusion and sold commercially, with the proceeds going to the care of wounded Union soldiers. But it really speaks, I mean, maps tell stories. That was the thing that I haven't heard, and I was thinking of this morning, and I neglected to mention it when I was talking before. Maps tell stories, and that one tells a very powerful story, both about the prevalence and location of slavery, but also about the reason for the conduct and the conduct of that Civil War. The other map that many of you may know of, which is entirely different from anything shown here, is Menard's map of the rise and fall of the failure of Napoleon's invasion of Russia. And it's actually partly a map and partly a statistical graphic, because it shows this huge, it has sort of a geographic background. But what it really shows you is this huge army going into Russia and then gradually trickling to a few survivors who came back. And it's a marvelous kind of dynamic story that that particular map tells. And perhaps there are others of that same ilk, but that's perhaps one of the most amazing examples of the use of maps to tell really powerful stories that I have ever encountered. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Christian.
I think that one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, which picks up on something that Bob mentioned earlier and sort of mentioned again, and Max mentioned, and Martin mentioned yesterday as well, and that is the idea of what a map is and what these maps that we've looked at this week mostly, or this week, feels like this week, these last 2 days, in a good way. Yeah. What we have in archives, like APS, actually not like an APS, but what we usually have in archives are commercial maps, right? Maps printed for public sale that are printed maps. And one of the great things about Aaron's exhibit and some of the conversations we've had today are about these manuscript maps that are stages on the way to these printed maps. And I think we need to pay more attention to the way that maps become maps and to take them apart again. And in so doing, we can understand and recover local understanding of space and the way that those local understandings of space collided with other understandings of space, whether those be Native American, whether those be where a particular division in a line is. And if we spend time looking at them and taking them apart and thinking about them, I think there are a lot more stories lurking in those maps than perhaps we tend to see.
Gentleman in the back.
What I found interesting here is that, going back to what you're saying, is like most of the maps we're talking about were printed maps, Western maps. There was Polynesian maps, the way the Polynesians used to sail. They actually have, which I've seen before, is that they used to interweave pieces of wood to show the currents of, and because they were famous for sailing. There was a European sailor with them. And they said, how can they navigate in the night, in the fog, where there are no stars? They knew the currents. So they're current maps, and then the way they would it looks so abstract you would never know it was a map. So there is that kind of thing too, you know. So that it can be an abstract language where you have to have the code before you actually read the map.
Yep.
All right, I have one question, and this one might be too deep. I don't know. It was weighing on me today.
It's not what wars are we going to be fighting?
Oh, no.
God,
But
on our pay grade.
So, the question that kept coming to my mind was: it seems like there's just this inherent need to rationalize and define space, and maps provide like a vehicle to try to do that. And I don't know. That's an idea that. I don't know. I'm just going to leave it at that.
Can you repeat the question? Is there an abstract need?
An inherent need for humans to rationalize space, and so that being why we all look at maps we view them as such authorities of space. I don't know.
Well, I mean, from a cognitive sense, of course, there's an inherent need to make sense of space because, to get food, to not be eaten, to navigate in an environment, right? I mean, of course, right? These things are built into our brains, and so the map is kind of a step removed from that because that's kind of abstraction of space, and you are choosing certain kinds of information to represent over others, and you're trying to maybe understand something about the relationship, but then of course I think there's a broader worldview that map making is a process of reflecting, but also making a worldview. I guess you could say that you're positioning yourself. I mean, I think as we've seen in a lot of these papers, you're positioning yourself in relation to other people. You're defining yourself in conjunction with people. You're defining yourself against people. You're placing. Frequently, you'll see maps put you or your people are kind of at the center, right? So if, a different story if an American is making a world map than if somebody in China or Japan is, right? So yeah, I think there's definitely an inherent need to make sense of space. I think the interesting question is then how do people go about doing that? And I think in the panel on indigenous cartography, I think we yesterday we especially the last paper, the caves, right, the kind of the spaces where we're learning about space. We see that there are many different kinds of knowledge. There are different forms of knowledge that go into making landscapes legible for different types of people. So yeah, I mean, there's kind of a question of need, right? I mean, how much space are we talking about? Are we talking about the world? Are we talking about just needing to navigate a more local environment? So. Yeah, I don't know if that answers a question, but maybe starts a discussion. I don't know.
I teach a course at UVA called Maps in World History, and one of the things I like about it is that you can go from prehistory to the present in any culture and find something that we could call a map that you can use to open something up about that culture. So it is human and universal in that sense. But gesturing to the literature that you mentioned on spatial cognition and wayfinding, psychologists have a really well-developed kind of research approach to how the brain interprets space. And so I've been trying to interrogate this in part to understand indigenous cartographies, because since we don't have such a rich source base, we can think about what's going on cognitively in relation to these maps. The other scholarly area I think a lot of us would be interested in, if you don't know about it already, is the philosophy of space and place, especially the way these scholars try to reconstruct what they call the phenomenology of space, the human individual experience of what it means to look up and look down and to have a body and to travel through space. So these are literatures that I think all of us as historians would be, there's a payoff to coming into engagement with it, to offer these kind of precise concepts and deeply thought out approaches to human spatiality, I guess we could call it.
Great, thanks. Two last questions, one here and one back. Oh, yeah,
something to add to that. That just occurred to me. Another sort of unique aspect of the kinds of maps that we've talked about at this conference is that they're public. And that is not necessarily the case with important maps. And I was reminded of having poked around a little bit in some pre-modern Chinese history, where there were extraordinarily accurate maps prepared of various regions of China, strictly by the Imperial or whatever the leadership was at those particular times. And they were kept secret. They were used for military purpose. They were very strictly means of control, rational means of control, but by no means open to everyone.
There's actually a little bit of a parallel in the present. If you think about it, we have something like Google Maps, right? That tells us a lot about where we are, and it helps us find where we want to go. But of course, our using our phones to do just that, well, that generates data, right? That is collected by giant corporations, and they don't make that data public, right? So, so yeah, I mean, the public-private, I think that's an interesting tension. Thanks.
Thank you.
I have a comment that I think is trying to weave together some of the larger themes that we've been talking about. So the power of maps, what they're representing. One of the things that really stood out to me in terms of absence was things like domestic spaces. And so I'm sitting here thinking about the explicitly imperial function of maps that I think has been traced throughout this conference. And the way that, when we talk about how maps tell us where to go, this is another thing, or that maps tell stories. I'm thinking about a lot of women authors, in particular in the 19th century, because that's my area, that, like Sarah Orne Jewett's Country of the Pointed Firs is often referred to as a point to organize narratives of community, and how community and these types of definitions of spaces emerge through completely different textual modes. And so I'm wondering if, I guess a question that comes out of this is whether our attention to maps and the things that we're focusing on in this conference almost reify the same institutional powers that we're trying to trouble.
Yes. Yeah, well, I mean, I think Martin kind of hinted at, in his commentary, people copying maps, and women in particular copying maps and seeing that as part of this, Republican, motherhood ideology, right? So I guess it's been a little present, but I think you're 100% right, and it's, when you're, how to put it, at the APS, when you're at, because it's an institution that's holding this conference, and it's not always easy to criticize the mother's milk, the source that, not to be too critical or anything, but just an observation about why that might have been. I don't know.
I want to defend the society, if I may, because one of the things I ran across fooling around quite recently was another little gem about Alexander Dallas Bache. He hired, in the course of his navigational work, he hired a woman named Maria Mitchell. Maria Mitchell was one of the sort of second, third, and fourth women ever elected to membership in the APS in the 1868, 1869, something like that. But the other thing that's interesting about it is that, and he was criticized for hiring a woman to work on this coastal survey stuff, and he said she just discovered a comet. She's as good as anybody at this, and so he kept at it. They were actually distant cousins because Mitchell was a direct descendant of Peter Folger, who lived variously in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Nantucket, and Martha's Vineyard, who was Benjamin Franklin's maternal grandfather. Anyway, I just thought that was an interesting sidelight. So we're not all bad. We got a terrible history. There's no doubt about that. But there are some good things about the place.
Just one additional response to that question. I mean, in my comments, and I heard it in some others, I think it pays a dividend to not be too reverential about even the most beautiful maps. In the same way, some of us have pored over the papers of people who do very ugly things, slave owners and others. It's easy to be seduced a little bit by their cogency and the beauty with which they write, the information they give us as historians that we're always after. But I think it's good to be a little skeptical of what the intention is. And to speak to your concern about domestic spaces, I think the largest scale maps we really talked about as a group were urban plans. But architectural plans are maps too, and usually aren't considered as such. I would just point out my colleague and friend Lewis Nelson has a recent book on architecture and empire in Jamaica that tries to make the architectural plan as a basis for a new kind of spatial history of slavery, and it really, I think, speaks to some of what you missed maybe in our remarks. You might like it.
Larry?
Wow, what a fabulous conference, getting us to think provocatively about the role of maps. When I asked to make a comment, I was going to mention that the most of the maps in the period we're talking about dealt with contested spaces, which was settling titles to land. So they were very, very local, because at the end of the Revolution, land titles were totally messed up and they had to be settled. The second largest number of maps made in this period had to do with the exploitation of the land, and particularly the surveying of rivers, because the canal era was about to begin. And the surveying of the rivers caused a lot of foreigners who could make maps to come to the United States. And after they did their surveys, they became unemployed, but they used their surveys to create state maps or area maps, which brings me to the role of the map maker. Most of them had great dreams about making a map that would contain all the information that they knew at a period of time. And sadly, almost universally, they had very sad and ends to their careers. So the map makers we should be talking about. Final comment on what Bob Hooser was saying about that map of the slaves in the South. That map was included in the Lincoln's signature of the Emancipation Proclamation in the background as an inspiration. It's in all of the images of that. And then one final footnote, Alexander Dallas Bache, until today, I thought that he founded the Coastal Survey. And, but we've learned a lot today.
And it is funny because I actually had thought the same thing.
Yes.
He followed Hasler, which I didn't realize.
Yeah.
We have run a little long. I had one last question. You guys don't have to answer it unless you can do it in like one sentence. But it's actually related a little bit to what Larry was saying too, which is I think we got the title of the conference was "The Power of Maps and the Politics of Borders." I think we had a lot of clarity about what the politics of borders means, but I never quite got to what the power of maps are. It seems to be implied and understood, but never really stated. So I don't know if you all could quickly say what you think the power of maps is, quickly.
Well, I would just say,
It's like Jeopardy.
because every map, we really understand it by excluding things. So it tells us those things that are selected as important.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know that I have a great answer, but I know in my own work I was really interested in looking at people who I think frequently didn't know themselves. They had a sense that these things were powerful, but they couldn't articulate why. They used them, and sometimes there was success, sometimes there wasn't success. But I guess I would just, I think, Matthew, you kind of hinted at this in a response today, but, you know, it's an assumption. It's an assumption to think that these people knew exactly what these maps were for and what they were doing with them. So, yeah, I think coming from a place of ignorance is sometimes a good methodology, let's say.
I don't know. I'm calling a lifeline right now.
Bob, you're the lifeline.
I mean, I'm intrigued by the way that maps can circulate, that they're a form of literacy, that people invest. It's almost like a transubstantiation. They just go from, these lines to this notion of kind of physical realities. So.
Maps extend the visual window of observation.
Great. Thank you, and I hope you all will think on that. I want to, before we conclude, just extend a few words of thanks. I especially want to thank all of the people that made this conference such a success, which of course includes all of you, but also all the people who made sure that the PowerPoint was working, that the video was live streaming. I just got a report that we had just short of 1,000 people watch over the course of the day, and that excludes the last panel. So we reached far beyond just this room, and that was made possible largely by Jeremy Schroenrock, Todd Schroenrock, and Christina Schroenrock, who have been working diligently to make sure that everything is running smoothly. I also, of course, want to thank Maggie Hoot and Jessica Frankenfield and Janine Bolt, who have been helping in a variety of ways, and of course Brenna Holland and Adriana Link for making everything else really happen and pulling the program together. So thank you all for your work. And thank you all for your intellectual work over the past 2 days, which, as Christian noted, felt like a whole week's worth of work. So thank you.